Hello and welcome to our presentation on exploring large language models for healthcare. My name's Dr. Annabelle Painter and I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Visiba.
And I'm Marcus Oliver-Crona, and I'm Head of AI and Medical at Visiba. And before we dive into healthcare-specific applications, we'll just briefly touch on what LLMs actually are and how they work. And so AI systems comprise various technologies, everything from expert systems to probabilistic programming and machine learning. And in machine learning, we optimize a model's parameters using examples of input and output for some specific purpose. And again, there are many ways to do this, one of which is neural networks. The transformer is a neural network architecture, so just the way of how the parameters are connected to each other. And an LLM is a transformer, which, as the name implies, is large, typically on the scale of hundreds of billions of parameters, which is used for natural language processing. So it takes text as an input and produces text as an output. And there were examples before that, but in 2020, when OpenAI released their GPT-3 model, that was really the moment that sparked the interest in the general public of LLMs, and perhaps even in AI overall. Nowadays, all big tech companies have their own models, such as Google's Gemini, and there are also companies which exist solely for their large language or large foundational models, such as Anthropic with their Claude models. There are also a few healthcare-specific models, such as Google's MedPalm, MedPalm 2, which Annabelle will talk about shortly, and its derivative, Amy. So how do they work? How are they trained? These models take a text sequence as input, and every word in the sequence is so-called embedded into a numerical space where similar words are close to each other in this space. And then all of these words are processed by the hundreds and billions of parameters in the model until we get into an output, which is a probability distribution over the model's vocabulary. So for every possible word, the model is predicting the probability that the next word is just that. And during training, the model is rewarded for assigning a high probability to the correct word. When we're using the model, we can either simply take the most probable word, or we can sample from this distribution. You can sometimes control this using something like the temperature parameter. This model is autoregressive, which means that when it has generated one word, it can then feed that back into its own input to generate the next word, and the next, and the next, and then eventually we have our entire answer. And so perhaps simplistically, you could say that these models are just taking text as an input, and they're generating text as an output. That's all they're doing. So what are they good at then? What are their strengths? Well, first off, because they're trained on a large volume of and a varied set of data, they have strong zero or few shot performance. What this means is just that they can do a lot of different tasks, either using no examples or just a few examples. And this is in contrast to a lot of AI, which is quite task specific. They're trained to do one thing and one thing only. And because they're using text as an input, they're easy to work with. Text is not always the best way to represent something for a computer, but it's usually an easy way to do it, and it works well enough. It's a decent enough alternative. And so especially in context where performance is not critical, being able to just work with text and having a strong performance, competitive performance without task-specific fine-tuning is really appreciated. Because they're trained on language, it's a language model, right? They're really naturally good at natural language, so they tend to produce a good language. And they're also good at generating structured language. And so this combination means that they can be used in quite a lot of different contexts and use cases. And this is not part of it's not inherent to the LLM architecture or the model family, but something that's a result of how they're trained. But it's generally true for most of the models you see out there today, and that's that they are both polite and sympathetic, which is perhaps not exactly what you would expect from an AI.
So if we think about the capabilities of LLMs, specifically in a clinical context, LLMs were initially designed as translation tools, and they were designed to translate between different languages. And of course, that's very helpful in a medical context where patients may speak various different languages, but it's also helpful in translating the language of medicine itself. It's estimated that a doctor in training learns 15,000 different medical terms, as well as hundreds of different medical acronyms. This can make understanding medical documentation very challenging for lay people. And as patients are having more access to their medical records, understanding those medical records can be really difficult. LLMs can play a really useful role in translating that medical jargon into understandable, layperson readable text. Part of this involves both expanding and summarizing notation. So for example, if a clinician after a consultation writes a succinct patient note which contains lots of jargon and abbreviations, that can then be translated into a longer form version of text that's easily understandable to a non-medical person. Equally, large volumes of medical text, for example, from a patient's clinical health record, can be summarized into a succinct patient note that can be very useful for the clinician when assessing patients. Another use case that's being used increasingly in healthcare is to summarize the transcription of a consultation that has taken place between a doctor and a patient, so that a doctor can speak naturally with a patient during a consultation, and then a consultation note can be automatically created, as well as a patient letter, and as well as any referral documentation that may be required. Part of that documentation process normally also involves coding, so whether that's coding from the clinical record or from letters that get sent between healthcare professionals. And LLMs can also help that coding process, picking out the key clinical bits of information and assigning appropriate codes autonomously. And then if we move away from the more administrative tasks where LLMs can add value, they've also shown to be very good at answering medical questions. So whether that's medical exam questions or answering, for example, the differential diagnoses that would be appropriate for a given clinical vignette. For example, a challenging vignette that's published in the New England Journal of Medicine. They've been shown to be very good at that task. Something that is perhaps more surprising as well is how good large language models have been shown to be at having empathetic patient conversations, which initially may have been thought to be something that was a very human-specific capability, but actually LLMs are showing a lot of promise in that area. So now we'll dig into a couple of examples of these capabilities for large language models. So earlier, Marcus mentioned a model called MedPalm-2. This is a model that's been created by Google, and of all the big tech players, Google are making the biggest strides when it comes to creating medically focused large language models. So MedPalm-2 was based on one of Google's general large language models called Palm-2, but then it was fine-tuned to the medical domain. And then it was tested on a benchmark set of USMLE-style exam questions. And you can see on the graph on this slide that the performance of LLMs has been increasing over time, and MedPalm-2 is now producing an outcome of around 85% in these exams. And I think it's worth noting that other LLMs, such as ChatGPT 4, are also performing at around an 80 to 85% performance in these exam questions. And then if you look at the diagram on the right, we can see how the performance of the LLM, which is the orange bars, compares to the performance of physicians in these exam questions in the blue bars. And what we can see is that the LLM performs better than physicians when it comes to things like comprehensiveness, when it comes to things like reasoning. But however, it is more likely to produce irrelevant or inaccurate information. By contrast, clinicians are more likely to omit information from their answers and may have answers that produce higher clinical risk. So a natural criticism of a study like this is, okay, well, it's all very well if LLMs can answer medical exam questions, but they don't reflect the reality of day-to-day clinical practice. Medicine is as much an art as it is a science, and a lot of what's difficult about working out what's wrong with a patient is actually eliciting that information from the patient and taking a good quality, in-depth and empathetic patient history. So the next step that Google took was to create a product that could do that. So they've now released something called Amy. And Amy has the ability to have a chat with patients and actually take a history. And once it's gathered this history, to then come up with a differential diagnosis of what might be going on with that patient. So the chat histories of Amy were compared to those of various physicians in Canada and in India, and then were judged by a panel of doctors and layperson actors on the medical quality of the answers produced by the LLMs and the physicians, but also on the quality of the conversation and how the lay actors felt they were perceived in terms of being empathetic and in understanding. And what was really interesting in terms of the medical performance of these tools is that Amy alone outperformed clinicians who are unassisted, clinicians using the search function, or clinicians using Amy. Amy on its own had the best outcomes when it came to medical performance. What's also interesting on the graph in the middle is that the domain in which Amy outperformed clinicians most was actually in the field of empathy. And I think this is quite surprising because, as I mentioned earlier, I think often it was felt like AI might take certain tasks in medicine out of the hands of doctors, but there are other characteristics of doctor and patient relationships, such as the ability to have an empathetic conversation, that were very much a quintessentially human skill. And I think this finding from this study is now starting to question that.
So we have some really strong demonstrations of what LLMs can do within medicine. What are their limitations then? What are the risks with using these models? Well, first, and perhaps surprisingly, I would argue that reasoning is one of their weaknesses. Surprising in light of the performance that Google demonstrated with MedPom 2. But they're not causal, but rather associative, and they lack an explicit world model. Are these required for reasoning? Up for debate. But I think the failure modes within reasoning that LLMs are demonstrating shows that they're not quite there yet. They also struggle with explainability. And you can ask an LLM to explain itself, and it will do so, or at least it will generate text that looks like an explanation, but it doesn't actually explain the text it previously generated. It is just more output. And it can also often be misleading, actually. And as briefly mentioned before, there are data which are better represented in other ways than just text, especially numeric data. And so this shows up as weaknesses when it comes to calculations. Annabelle will show a concrete example within medicine later, and also uncertainty. So these models, they do express uncertainty over the next word, but if you ask them to express uncertainty over a differential diagnosis, for example, or clinical risk for a certain patient, this is not something that they're natively trained to do. And you always have a flip side of a coin, right? They are polite and sympathetic, but they can be too eager to please. And so sometimes they tend to give you the answer that you have indicated that you wanted, rather than actually the correct one.
So if we think about clinical risks when it comes to LLMs, one of the ones that's frequently talked about is about bias. And this is the risk that LLMs might replicate or actually accentuate existing biases that are within the training data that LLMs are being used to train on, which could result in inequitable outcomes for patients using those tools. A second major concern comes when we think about hallucinations, or medically what might be more appropriately termed confabulations of large language models, as well as omissions. So when the large language model might insert something into some clinical documentation that is inaccurate, or it might miss things out from the record that are important. And there's a concern that over time, as documentation gets repeatedly put into the record, that these kind of errors might get accentuated and perpetuated over time. Other concerns include the fact that responses to LLMs vary depending on the prompt that's used. And this can make it really difficult to evaluate LLMs because the output that will be given be dependent and variable, and so it can be hard to quantify exactly the accuracy of a given LLM to a specific medical scenario. A final concern is about clinical safety risks in general, and we'll come on to those in more detail with some examples now. So if we first touch on this question about bias, so there have been some early studies that have looked into this. And there are some studies that have used ChatGPT-4 to run some scenarios which have demonstrated that there is medical bias within these tools. So this first example is a study in which ChatGPT-4 was asked to produce medical vignettes of various different healthcare conditions. And it was asked to produce 1,000 different vignettes for every condition. And what we can see in the results here is that there was variations in terms of the racial disparities in these groups for the vignettes that were not aligned with the true prevalence of these diseases. So for example, if we look at the top left, the red dot there represents the true prevalence of disease, and the blue dot represents the prevalence as per the vignettes created by ChatGPT-4. So we can see that in the case of sarcoidosis or in HIV and AIDS, it was much more likely that the patient vignette was someone who was Black than it was someone who was white. And this shows how there's amplification of bias and of these racial discrepancies that gets accentuated by using these large language models. In a second study, ChatGPT-4 was asked to emulate being a clinician of various different demographics. So for example, different races, different genders, and different political affiliations, and was then asked to save one of a group of patients who each had an equal chance of surviving a medical condition. And what it was found was that the simulated doctors of different demographic groups generally favored patients of the same demographics to themselves. When the doctor was asked to be, was not given any instruction about what their demographics were, then it was found that the patients who were preferred to be saved were young and white and male. When they were asked to be democratic in terms of their political affiliation, then they were more likely to save Black women. When they were Republican, more likely to save white men. So I think this is really interesting because it shows that there is bias baked in these systems, and it's just something that we need to be really careful of and to be actively monitoring when developing LLMs in healthcare. So when we talk about safety concerns, this particular trial is linked to the area where we work, which is looking at triage. So in this study, it looked at patients coming to the emergency department. So 37 patients attended the emergency department and were first triaged using a Bayesian reasoning algorithm called ADA. Once they had been triaged, the output from that tool was shown to 3 ED physicians, and it was also put into ChatGPT 3.5, ChatGPT 4, and also it was put through WebMD, which is another Bayesian reasoning AI tool. What we can see from the results here is that actually, of all the models, it was ChatGPT-4 that had outputs that were most likely to agree with the physician's triage scores of these cases. So that's quite promising. However, what's concerning is that ChatGPT had much higher rates of unsafe triage outcomes being given, especially ChatGPT 3.5, but also ChatGPT-4, much more so than the Bayesian reasoning algorithms. So I think what this underlies is that although ChatGPT and LLMs can have high accuracy levels, there's also significant clinical risk that comes with them, and that needs to be thought through carefully. So Mark has mentioned there before about an example for calculations. So here, ChatGPT was asked to do a dose conversion of 2 different opiate medications. So the request here was a 40-year-old lady is taking a dose of 60 milligrams QDS of dihydrocodeine. What is the equivalent dose of oxynorm, so of slow-release oxycodone? What ChatGPT produces here is quite interesting because it has a lot of explanatory text about how it's come up with its final answer. And within this explanatory text, there is a lot of convincing factual information. For example, it correctly talks about the dose conversion between codeine and morphine being a 10-to-1 conversion. It also talks about the dose conversion between morphine and oxycodone as being 1.5 to 2, which again is accurate. It then performs calculations based on that reasoning and comes up with a final answer. However, rather than dividing numbers as it should be, it multiplies them so that the final dose that it suggests is 3,600 milligrams, when for reference, the accurate number here should probably be something between 15 and 20 milligrams. So this is clearly, concerning from a clinical safety point of view, and it's something we need to be really cautious of when using LLMs.
So we have lots of potential, lots of possibility, but also a lot of risks. So what does this mean for the possibility of using LLMs as medical devices then? Well, first off, we don't have any approved LLM medical devices yet. And while an LLM might be broad and general purpose, a medical device needs to have a clear, specific intended use, saying this is exactly the clinical purpose that this device should fulfill, and it needs clinical validation showing that it can do so and in a safe way. And this will mostly be reiterating what Annabelle has already said, because at the very core of a medical device is risk, right? But especially so when it comes to bias and transparency. As a manufacturer, you need to be able to show where the training data you have trained your model comes from. You need to show that it's not biased. What can you do to ensure that it's not biased? And you need to have transparency in how the model works towards its users. And ideally, you should also have explainability. You should be able to explain why a certain conclusion was made. Hallucination is also a particular risk, and it's of particular interest here because it's difficult to mitigate. Because an LLM can hallucinate in ways which are, they seem plausible and they are very close to the truth, but they're actually very incorrect, and it's difficult for a human to spot. And this means that it's a high risk when it comes to using them as a medical device. And in terms of robustness, the lack of output consistency is an issue, so that you can have them be deterministic in the sense that a given input will always give the same output. However, a small change to this input might have might lead to a large change in the output. And because of the wide input space and output space, it means that these are difficult to test. It's difficult to ensure that they're actually safe. And then finally, if you would want to use a third-party LLM and not develop it in-house, you face additional challenges, because then you're responsible for the entire chain of manufacturing. So all of these risks above, but if you don't control these issues or these processes, it's very difficult to ensure that they're actually safe. And so where do we think we're going from here then in the next few years? Well, first off, we've talked language models now, and we said something about multimodal models, which can also take images as input, but you can go much beyond that as well. So this is a really interesting patient forecasting, where instead of using text, they use clinical codes as their input. And so I think we'll see research at least moving in this direction, where we have true multimodal models, which use much more than just simply text and images.
So practically, what can we expect in the healthcare sphere when it comes to LLMs in the next few years? Well, in the short term, the LLMs we're going to likely see in the market are those that are not medical devices. So these are the kind of tasks we were talking about earlier in terms of administrative assistive tools. So things like coding of notes, summarizing notes, taking a transcription of a consultation and turning that into notation for clinical use. And then we may also see them being used in other areas where medical devices are not required. So for example, as research assistive tools, and also in medical education and training. And then down the line, we will likely see the use of medical device LLMs. And these could be used in a whole host of different tasks. For example, they may be used as therapeutic chatbots to talk to patients and deliver therapeutic beneficial treatments such as cognitive behavioral therapy for mental health disorders. We may also see them as clinically assistive tools, and we may be able to eventually use them in the way that Marcus was just describing, to predict the health outcomes of different patients and intervene appropriately.
And so it's clear that we need more regulatory guidance on how LLMs can be used for medical devices, and perhaps especially so the use of third-party LLMs. We also need better methods of evaluation of LLMs, and especially when it comes to hallucinations, omissions, and bias, which are of particular importance for healthcare. And as these things start to crystallize, we might see increasing guardrails on the general purpose LLMs. So ChatGPT might be hesitant to give you medical device, especially, exactly because of the requirements on medical devices. Another interesting trend that we're observing is that the mainstream interest for LLMs is driving a general healthcare adoption of AI, of other technologies as well. And we're also really interested in the potential of using LLMs for what they're really good at, interacting with humans and text, as an interface to other types of AI systems. And so overall, it's a very interesting time to live in when it comes to AI in the healthcare space. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.